Our speaker today is Patrick O'Donnell. He's a historian, best-selling author, and professional speaker who has written 12 critically acclaimed books that recount the epic stories of America's wars from the Revolution to Iraq. He's a premier expert on elite and special operations unit and irregular warfare. O'Donnell's books are described as nonfiction that reads like fiction. Patrick O'Donnell is a fellow at Fred W. Smith Library for the Study of George Washington at Mount Vernon. And we have to thank for this event. Special thanks go to Indiana Humanities in cooperation with the National Endowment for the Humanities. They gave us a really great grant that went for this. Our primary sponsors are VFW Post 1110, Industrial Federal Credit Union, Encompass Credit Union, the Ransom Family Advised Endowment Fund of the Clinton County Community Foundation, general sponsors, American Legion Post number 12, Gongwer Powers Insurance, Knights of Columbus, Mary Queen of Peace Assembly of Frankfurt and Lebanon, Skiles Electronic Inc. So thank you to all of our sponsors. I'm going to unpin myself now.
Wonderful. Well, first off, I'd like to thank all of our sponsors and also Mindy for all of her work at the library for having me on today. And I really appreciate that. All of my books have found me in one way or another. They've all been a journey, and The Unknowns is no exception to that. This book found me in 2010 when I was a battlefield guide in Normandy, France, and then also Belleau Wood, which is the hallowed ground of the Marine Corps. For those of you that don't know, Belleau Wood is where in the summer of 1918, actually in June 1918, the Marine Corps and the 2nd Division and 3rd Division of the US Army stopped Germany's great offensive on Paris. They were only about 40 miles away. And at that time, the French army was melting away. And it was the Americans that helped stop the German drive on Paris. And I was accompanying first the 5th Marines, and then later, where the idea really gelled, with something called the Wounded Warrior Regiment of the Marine Corps. And that consists of individuals in the Marine Corps that were wounded in battle. And many of these men were missing their arms and legs. And for me, I also had a connection with many of these men because I was a volunteer combat historian with 3-1 in the Battle of Fallujah, in a book I wrote called We Were One, which is right down here, which is on the Commandant's reading list. It's required reading for the Marine Corps. And it's a story of 8 best friends. And only 3 of those best friends survived. And I was embedded with this platoon and barely survived the conflict. In fact, I pulled out one of those best friends in a firefight who was mortally wounded. So I had deep connections with these men, and it was a deep honor for them to ask me to take them to France as a guide. And I did that at Normandy in particular. And we walked the beaches of Normandy, and I talked about World War II. But then we went to the hallowed ground of the Marine Corps, which is Belleau Wood, as I mentioned. And this is where the Marines stopped the Germans in 1918. And this is the so-called lore of the Corps. Here, the Marines changed from a 19th century army, really, to a 20th century modern force. And this was an epic ordeal at Belleau Wood. Belleau Wood is today a very, beautiful place. There's rolling fields of grain and hills and some lush green areas. But within all of that is, still its deadly past. Some of these trees are literally still riddled with gas shells, as these men had to, one of the great ordeals of World War I is to survive gas. And the shells are literally still entombed inside the bark of these trees. And as we walked around Belleau Wood and into this area, I was joined by the men, some of the men that I actually was in combat with. And we walked to a place called Hill 142. And Hill 142 is significant because it was the high ground at Belleau Wood. And it was here that the Marines launched attack across the wheat field. I was with some of these Marines right here. As you can see, this one Marine has lost his leg, and we're at a piece of field artillery, German field artillery that was left in the woods. And as we walked through there, we kind of felt the two generations meet, the World War I generation and this generation of Marines. And both had fought with a connection to World War I. We were in Iraq, in Fallujah, which was part of the Ottoman Empire during World War I. And that connection to that generation was felt that day. Because that generation, that World War I generation, World War I changed the world. It made America, it was the beginning of America as the dominant power. It was the beginning of modern medicine. It was the beginning of the modern Marine Corps. It was the beginning of the modern Army. It was the beginning of modern finance. It goes on and on and on. It was really the beginning of the American century in many ways. And as we walk through the footsteps of these men, I was joined by another guide, Ray Shearer, whose great uncle was at the Battle of Belleau Wood as an officer. And he was the one that actually declared the woods secure. But Ray talked about Hill 142 to all of us. And he said that Ernest A. Jansen, whose photo we have, was part of the 49th Company. And the 49th Company charged across the rolling wheat fields of Belleau Wood on June 6, 1918. This was their D-Day, if you will. And they were on the offensive. They mounted the attack against the German army and were pushing it back. And many of these men took horrendous casualties as they crossed the wheat field, and many were slain. But they made their way to the ground that we were on now, 142. And miraculously, after losing nearly half of the 49th Company, as well as another company, they secured the hill. But Ernest A. Jansen was a seasoned soldier in it, as well as a Marine. And what I mean by soldier is Jansen kind of had a hidden past that most of his men didn't know. He had changed his name to Charles Hoffman. And Ernest A. Jansen had a hidden past because he had deserted the army about 8 or 9 years earlier and changed his name to Jansen and joined the Marine Corps. And here he was as a senior NCO leading men and doing an amazing job at it too, because it would be here that Ernest A. Jansen would literally help save the battle. The Germans at this point, after the hill was secured miraculously, the Germans, their standard operating procedure was to immediately counterattack. And they did that in large numbers with, hundreds of men. And Jansen ordered his men, along with the company commander, to dig in and prepare for the attack. And that's exactly what they did. They dug in, but they were soon showered by, machine gun fire and even German stick grenades, like the one I'm holding right here. This is an original. It's deactivated, obviously. But these stick grenades and other things surrounded these guys. They're going off, and Jansen was keeping his men, in action. They were even armed with trench knives like this. This is an M1917 trench knife with a knuckle guard, which is really useful in hand-to-hand combat. But that's kind of where things were going. It was hand-to-hand, and Jansen in particular spotted a series of machine guns that were being set up that were going to basically flank his position, into the 49th Company's position, and overwhelm the entire hill. And it's here that Jansen sprung into action and, with his bayonet, literally disabled and killed several of these machine gunners, saving the day and the hill, and potentially an early part of the battle. And now the reason why I'm talking about this is Jansen was awarded the Medal of Honor. In fact, he was awarded 2 Medals of Honor. Because he was a Marine that was part of an Army unit, which was the 2nd Division, the 4th Brigade was attached to it. He received not only the Navy Medal of Honor, but also the Army Medal of Honor, receiving therefore 2 Medals of Honor. It's a practice that was done away with after World War I. So he was really one of the first Medal of Honor recipients for the American Expeditionary Force in World War I. But what Ray said to me was what I mean by how a story found me. Jansen was then critically wounded in the attack and basically has to survive his wounds, which is very, very difficult, but he managed to survive. But as after the war ends, he is selected to be a body bearer for the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. When Ray mentioned the fact that there were body bearers that were bringing back the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, it raised a question in my mind: who were the other men? And that's interesting. Maybe their story had not been told, and indeed, that's exactly the case. The story of the unknown soldier is in and of itself unknown because of the nature of the soldier, but the story of how he was brought back and the story of these men was unknown until I wrote the book. And what the Unknowns is a combat history of these 8 men and their story to bring them home, to bring the unknown soldier home, as well as the man that selected the unknown soldier, an enlisted man named Edward Younger. And all of these stories were chosen, these individuals were chosen by John Pershing specifically to tell the story of World War I, because each represents a different branch of service as well as a different military occupation specialty. In fact, you have the cavalry in here, you have the artillery, the field artillery, the heavy artillery, you have the Navy, and the Marine Corps. Different men that represent a different slice of World War I. And that's what makes The Unknowns a very powerful story, because it tells the story of the American Expeditionary Force through their eyes. So there's a photo of 8 men in the book, and these are the body bearers, and these are the principal focus of my book that I get into in The Unknowns. But I'd like to sort of walk you through some of the body bearers and their stories, because they're really, truly extraordinary and interesting. Most of them received the Distinguished Service Cross or the Medal of Honor or a very high-ranking medal because of what they achieved on the battlefield. It's really, truly exceptional. The first story is fit for a movie. If you've ever seen the movie Das Boot, which is a World War II movie about a German submarine, that's kind of where we're going to go with James Delaney. And James Delaney is a Navy chief in the U.S. Navy. But in 1917, before the war begins, James Delaney is part of what they call the Naval Guards, because Germany declares unrestricted submarine warfare on the Allies and targets the United States specifically. Now here we have a good picture of a U-boat sinking a steamer. And this is exactly what James Delaney was on. He was on one of these steamers, but as a guard, a naval guard, he had a 13-man crew that manned 2 deck guns on the steamer. Many of the steamers were unarmed, so the Germans were able to pick them off easily. So before the war, President Wilson decided to arm American merchant ships after so many shipping losses were sustained by the U-boats. It was an attempt to defend these merchant ships as they were sailing across the Atlantic. And Delaney was a he led this 13-man crew. And the steamer, it's August 6th, 1917, and it's a picturesque day. Picture it in the sea of, it's off of Spain, and the steamer is making its way towards a Spanish port with a payload of raw material from the United States. And it's here that U-boat 61, captained by a 29-year-old named Diekman, spots the SS Campana, which is the ship that Delaney and his 13-man crew are trying to defend. And at first, Diekman orders his U-boat 61, to dive. And the men fasten their watertight hatches, and they quickly dive. And it's here that they're a well-oiled machine. He raises his periscope and he orders a torpedo loaded into the tube, and he orders to fire upon the Campana as he gets it in its crosshairs. At this point, Diekman has over 43 ships that he had sunk. He's approaching so-called ace status, which is about 50 and 100 tons of ships that had been sunk. And he's closing in on that mark, and he sees a fresh target with the Campana. The torpedo barely misses the side of the Campana. And what's interesting is, at this time, torpedoes are a very precious commodity for a U-boat commander. They don't have a ton of them. They only have 6 to 10, maybe a few more torpedoes. And he's nearly out because he's already been on a long voyage. So he decides that the risk isn't that high, that he can finish off the Campana by maintaining a distance, the distance that his shells can hit that ship, and use his deck gun to finish off the boat. And then what happens next is really a truly extraordinary story. The Campana tries to outrun the U-boat, but remarkably, since the U-boat is on the surface, it's actually quite fast. And the two ships get into a duel of deck guns for the next 2 hours, and they fire upon each other relentlessly. And the shells from Delaney's crew are their guns aren't long enough. Diekman is smart enough to keep his boat out of their range, but his range, the range on his gun is just about there, and some of his shells start to strike home, and one hits the back of the ship, and then eventually a shell hits the engine room. And at this point, it's really quite remarkable. Both vessels had fired over 200 rounds, which is an enormous amount of ordnance for either side to fire. And the U-boat is firing relentlessly its deck gun, and it starts to hit home. And meanwhile, Delaney's crew is so they fired their guns so much that their ears are literally bleeding because of the concussion of the shell, and they're out of ammunition. And it's the captain of the boat, who's a civilian, that tells Delaney that it's time to give up. We don't have any more ammunition left. Delaney really wants to fight to the end, but the captain convinces him to surrender, and they raise a white flag, and the boat surrenders. They stop firing, and then it's at this point the U-boat sends out a small launch, and the crew they board the Campana, and the crew of the Campana also get in their lifeboats, and they move towards the U-boat, and both launches kind of meet in the middle of the water, and the Germans take them prisoner. Meanwhile, a German boarding party goes on the Campana, and they raid it first of food, because they're all starving on board their U-boat. They want fresh food and water and whatever else they can get. I mean, life on board a U-boat is a very dirty thing. Literally, grease and oil is in everything because of the moving parts. There's battery acid all over the place. There's water leaking. It's a really nasty environment. And the first thing that they do is try to seize food as well as a bar of soap. And they want to clean themselves of all this grease and muck that they have, which they do. But they also plant charges on board the Campana, and they plan to, after they seize some paperwork and some of the breaches on the gun so that they could disable it, they blow the Campana out of the water basically, and it sinks about an hour later. And then what happens next is really a great story. It's the Das Boat story that I sort of told you about earlier. It's James Delaney and the men that are on his crew, as well as the captain, suddenly get a view of life aboard a U-boat, which few Americans ever got a chance to do in the war. And they literally live as prisoners of war. And Diekman is a very interesting character, almost a I don't want to say a Captain Nemo type, but he speaks perfect English. He's charismatic. He tries to glean information from Delaney about what his his operations and missions were. Delaney lies through his teeth, but the captain is just like kind of laughing at him because he knows exactly, he's got the log and everything else. He knows exactly what they were up to and doing. But he sort of develops a mutual respect. The two men develop a mutual respect for one another, because over the next several weeks, they endure hell together. Diekman sinks several new ships, but in the process, the crew of the few members of the crew that were captured, the others were let go by Diekman, but the military members of the crew and the officers were taken aboard as prisoner. They get to feel firsthand what it's like and how dangerous it is to be in a U-boat. They're depth charged. They encounter a situation which is known as a Q ship, where British vessels disguise themselves as harmless little merchant ships, but in reality, after the subsurface, they had hidden guns that they had often put under crates and nets that revealed themselves, and then they tried to blast the sub out of the water. And Diekman and Delaney had a taste of that firsthand and barely survived as they quickly dove back under the ocean. And it was there that they survived a depth charge attack. They went through a minefield. I mean, they barely survived. And in the process, they become, there's a sense of mutual respect and camaraderie. And the two crews, they have a respect for one another, and there's a bit of a bond. And at the end of the voyage, they pull into Kiel, which is the area that the German Navy is their main base. And it's here that Diekman lines up the crew of U-boat 61 along with the Americans, and they take a photo. And it would be the last photo for all of the members of U-boat 61. It would be the last, one of the last moments of many of these men, because literally weeks later, U-boat 61 would never be seen again. It's presumed that it had sunk during operations against an Allied vessel at the time. But Delaney and the other men then endure great hardship. They're sent to a German prisoner of war camp, and they somehow have to survive this experience, which is, it's tough. It's not a concentration camp, but many of the men are starving. And it's not necessarily because the Germans want them to starve, but they're starving with the rest of the German population, because the Allied embargo that is ringing Germany is preventing a lot of food from getting in. So everybody in Imperial Germany and Austria are effectively starving. And the men that are these Americans also undergo it. They also go through sort of forced labor. They act as farmers. Working on farms, and Delaney actually tries to escape a couple times, but he's captured. But they they endure a really tough bit of war. And it's not until December 1918, when the war ends, that James Delaney is released and makes his way back to America. And James Delaney stays in the Navy. He continues into World War II. He's from Marblehead, which, interestingly enough, my 12th book, called The Indispensables, is a book about the Marblehead Regiment during the Revolutionary War. But James Delaney continues on, and then in 1921, which I'll get to in a little bit, he becomes an honorary member of the Body Bearers, which leads me to sort of my next vignette, if you will, of one of the individuals that are in the book, and that's of really an extraordinary soldier, General Pershing, who's the general commander in chief of American forces, the American Expeditionary Forces in World War I. Black Jack Pershing considers the greatest soldier of the war. His name is Samuel Woodfield, and Samuel Woodfield is like Sergeant York, one of the most famous members of the American Expeditionary Forces. He's an infantryman. He's a lieutenant/captain that's promoted to captain, and he's part of the 5th Division. And the largest battle of World War I, this book goes through the major campaigns of the war. It begins in the trenches in 1917, 1918, outside of Verdun, and then it goes to in there in the trenches outside of Verdun, there are incredible trench raids, and the book captures interesting characters, such as a guy by the name of Gatling Gun Parker, who the Germans were determined to make an example of his unit in the field. And it's here we also encounter a loving dog. There's so many really kind of interesting characters in the book. I find Sergeant Stubby, the 102nd Regimental Bridle Pattern Bull Terrier, one of the most interesting characters in the book, because he helps save several men in the trench raid. And it's not a made-up story. A lot of it, it's really quite extraordinary how this small little mascot is an incredible character in and of himself, and helps save several Americans. And I recommend the animated feature that came out a few years ago. It's quite good. So anyways, we move from the trenches, we move from Belleau Wood, we move through some of the offensive actions and the holding actions against the German army, to eventually sort of the climactic battle in the unknowns, which is the Meuse-Argonne offensive, where there's over 1.5 million, nearly 1.5 million Americans are involved. It's the largest battle in American history. It's here that the American Expeditionary Force really starts to, it initially doesn't go very well, but it eventually has a major role in concluding the war by piercing what's known as the Hindenburg Line. And these were some of the most formidable defenses in the world. They were considered impenetrable for 4 years, nearly 4 years. The French army had contested many portions of the Hindenburg Line and were gored. And it was here that many of the men in the book, the body bearers, all in some ways meet or are in battle. And it's here that Samuel Woodfield has really an extraordinary incident where he's the story begins where he's sleeping in about 4 feet of water in a trench that is just filled with 4 feet of water, because that's the only safe space that he can find. And this man is waterlogged. He is filled with fleas and other vermin that are crawling all over his body. This is very typical of what these men went through. Just a horrific experience, a dog's life, if you will, in the trenches. And that morning he wakes from his water-filled trench, and he's ordered to put out a sort of a reconnaissance mission in force, and he leads his men into no man's land. And it's here that they're engaged almost immediately. And it's from a bell tower that Samuel Woodfield senses a sniper. And he and the rest of the men are armed with a very accurate rifle, the M1903 Springfield, which fires a 30-06 round, bolt action, 5 rounds in a clip. He disables the sniper in the bell tower with 2 well-aimed shots, takes him out basically. And the sniper is also armed with a machine gun, so he's eliminated. And Woodfield goes one by one and takes out, remarkably, a total of 5 German machine gun nests. As he's moving through no man's land, they're hit with gas. And gas, as I mentioned, is very, very dangerous. Gas is in 2 forms, or several forms. There's chlorine gas, there's blister gas, and also mustard gas. And these men would quickly try to put on what I'm holding right here, a gas mask. This is an original gas mask from World War I. You have one in the picture here. And he wasn't able to put it on fast enough. The mustard got in his face and in his eyes, but he kept pushing forward. And he encountered another, his eyes were very heavily watered, but he was able to continue forward, and he disabled another machine gun nest. His bolt action rifle was out of ammunition. He pulled out his M1911 Colt pistol, fired, the rounds jammed. A German officer pulled out a Luger and fired at him and missed. And Woodfield was able to, he spied a pickaxe off to the side and was able to dispatch the man with a pickaxe, killing him. And therefore, remarkably, taking out 5 machine gun nests as he brought his men back. This was witnessed by several men. It's not something that was made up, and it's in the official records. And Samuel Woodfield receives the Medal of Honor for the incident. The next man is sort of I think a really amazing story. It's a different kind of courage. Samuel Woodfield, receives the Medal of Honor for dispatching the enemy. Then our next body bearer, O'Connor, receives it for saving lives. And he has arguably the dirtiest job in the Navy. He's a boiler tender on the USS Mount Vernon, which prior to the war was a German cruise liner. It was a massive cruise liner. They sort of picture a smaller version of the Titanic, and that's what you're dealing with this ship that was prior to being called the Mount Vernon. Was a German vessel that at the beginning of the war found itself off the coast of Maine, and it visited Maine, and it hoped to avoid the relentless British Navy and find safe haven there, and then get provisions and then make its way back to Germany. But the United States was neutral at the time, and it wouldn't allow that. But there was also another motivating factor. The United States at that time didn't have many merchant ships. It was very low on transports, but there was something very enticing about the Crown Prince Castle, AKA now the Mount Vernon. It was carrying tons of German gold in its hold. And it was seized by the United States government in 1914. And then it was given a paint job sort of a dazzle pattern, as you can see there. They splashed kind of these dazzling camouflage stripes across it, which was designed to confuse a German, as it was a German U-boat captain as he was looking through his periscope. So he couldn't determine necessarily, they hoped, the speed of the boat, which was important to calculate a torpedo. And that's exactly what was about to face Charles Leo O'Connor as he was in his boiler room in September 1918. After several cruises across the Atlantic transporting troops, they were on their way back to the United States and they thought safety. The ship had a complement of wounded soldiers, many of whom were carrying the plague. They were infested with the virus of 1918 that would kill upwards of 50 million people. The ship was literally a plague ship. It was the crew was trying to keep itself safe as the virus was running rampant across its decks. They now had another problem though. A U-boat had spotted the Mount Vernon as it was leaving Brest on its way home to the United States and fired a torpedo. The torpedo hit home, and it basically detonated not far from where Charles Leo O'Connor was tending the boiler and putting loaded bits of coal into the furnace of the boiler of the ship. And it was here that Charles Leo O'Connor is very badly burned from the incident. The torpedo, the furnace explodes, the boiler explodes. He's doused with hot water and cinders from the furnace of the boiler. But he has to make a split-second decision. Does he close the watertight door and save the ship, but also potentially doom some of the men that are in the boiler room? And barely alive, he somehow scrambles out the door and closes it. And that act literally closes the watertight compartment. Think of the story of the Titanic, where there's a series of watertight compartments in this massive ship. He closes the compartment and saves the ship, because if he had not closed the door, the ship would have sunk. It was that bad. But he's badly burned, and he, with all of his strength, he has to use his strength to close the door and turn a wheel that closes these massive doors, and he's able to do that. And he scrambles up to the top of the ship, and he saves a couple men in the process. And but he saves his ship. And at this point, I mean, the ship is in dire straits because it's sinking because of the torpedo. They have the plague is running rampant aboard the ship, and the U-boat's out there still. So the captain goes into evasive maneuvers, and they fire a deck gun. The crew atop the ship, not Charles Leo O'Connor, they fire a deck gun, and it forces the sub back under the water. And they also use what's known as depth charges, which are basically metal drums that are loaded with TNT that, after they go under the water a certain depth, they explode, which causes a massive concussion and can rupture a U-boat and break it in half, basically. But the captain, wards off the U-boat attack, and they go into, damage control immediately. They use wood and braces to shore up this massive hole that's on the side of the ship, and they're able to stop the water. And then they have to deal with the plague at the same time, and they somehow miraculously do both, and they're able to limp back into the harbor. And that, leads us to the very end of the war, where many of the men that are on the land, the Marines, and the men in the Army and the field artillery, heavy artillery, etc., they all several of them, all 5 of the 8, all cross paths at what's known as the Musee River crossing, where it's the last day of the war. It's quite a tragic thing. Pershing orders the American Expeditionary Force, to teach Germany a lesson, they attack in the final hours of the war, and they cross the Musee right here, as you can see. They have a small, tiny pontoon bridge that they make out of boards, and the men in the dead of the night cross this bridge. The Germans have it zeroed in. They throw artillery on it, machine gun fire. It's a horrific battle, and literally men are dying at the last hours of the war. They dig in on the other side. The Germans counterattack mercilessly. Many of the men barely survive. And, at the 11th hour of the 11th month in 1918 in November, the armistice begins and the war finally ends. And the men begin to come home. They stay there for occupation duty for nearly a year, many of them come home, and the war is winding down. And the war's winding down. It takes a while for the peace to begin, which, if you've studied the World War I, it changes the course of history. The world is rewritten after the war. The Middle East has changed. The Middle East that we see today is rewritten with boundaries that in many cases don't necessarily make sense, causing many of the problems of today. And the war event ends, but it lingers on. And the great powers want to memorialize it and find a way to sort of honor the sacrifices, which were enormous, of these men. And France is the first country that finds a way to do this through an unknown soldier. And they honor. There are many soldiers in the French army that are pulverized, or their remains are unknown, or they just disappeared. And France comes up with the idea of honoring them by creating a tomb of the unknown soldier, by finding one individual that is not known to history, and honoring that individual and using that as a way to honor all of those who had served in World War I. It's followed by England. The United States at the time doesn't really pay much attention to this. There are nearly 4,000 Americans that are in unknown status. Their remains are unknown, who they are. Artillery alone, for instance, pulverizes individuals. And it makes it very hard to distinguish who these people are. But the United States War Department at the time says, we can find them. It's kind of a really preposterous position, but they claim that they'll be able to find who these people are and identify them. And it's not until 1920 that a movement comes about by a woman editor of a very famous women's magazine at the time, Marie Maloney, who sees what's going on in France and England, says, look, we need to do this ourselves. And she's joined by a congressman in New York who was a white officer in a black regiment of men. He was part of what's known as the Harlem Hellfighters. And this congressman wanted to honor his men because he knew what the sacrifices that they had made. And they sort of join forces. The movement goes viral, and there's a massive movement for an unknown soldier. And that movement crystallizes. And in 1921, October 1921, the War Department authorizes a small group of men from the Graves Registration Unit to go to France, to go to the major cemeteries of France and carefully exhume unknown Americans that had fought in France that are buried there. They exhumed the bodies, then they carefully made sure that there were no identifying characteristics such as a dog tag or a letter or anything that could identify who these people were. They then took the burial tickets that each of the bodies had been buried in each of the cemeteries, and then they burned them. And they brought several of these bodies back to Chalon, at a place called the Hotel de Ville, the center of the city hall, and they put the bodies in state, and they were in flag draped caskets. And at this point, an American general is going to select America's unknown soldier. But that night, the French convinced the United States general, as well as other officers, that's not really appropriate. These are enlisted men that fought your war. They had fought in the trenches. They had fought in some of the bloodiest combat of World War I. You should allow an enlisted man to make that selection. And that night, the enlisted man that was selected was a man by the name of Sergeant Edward Younger. And Edward Younger was from Chicago. He was with the 9th Infantry Regiment. And the 9th, I follow Edward Younger's story through the whole book. He sees some of the toughest combat. He's wounded twice severely, and he's a perfect representative example of a doughboy, a man that sort of sees it all. He's not necessarily as decorated. He doesn't have the decorations of the other men, but he has the combat experience, and he was there. And that night, he's given the order, the honor of selecting the unknown soldier, which he immediately realizes is a massive responsibility. And he's given a bouquet of white roses. And that morning, he goes into the city hall where there are the flag draped caskets. And he's very nervous, prays. And, I found Edward Younger's original notes that are handwritten of what he remembers. And it's very powerful. He talks about how he feels that the man in the casket is somebody that he knows. It's a man that he was with, and his hand literally is guided to the casket, and he lays the flowers on it. And that individual is brought back to the United States. He's brought back on the USS Olympia, which is a ship that is still located in Philadelphia. It's an aging, remarkable cruiser. If you get a chance to visit it, go up there and visit the ship. It's an amazing. The Olympia is incredible. They transport it back, and the casket. It's really quite extraordinary. Casket is so large that they can't get it under the in the hull of the ship. And they also don't want to necessarily ding it or have any kind of dishonor. So they decide to basically chain it to the top of the deck. And this proves to be kind of not necessarily a great idea because the Olympia goes through a massive, like, hurricane style storm, and the casket nearly goes overboard. But the men that are the Marines on board the Olympia, literally they throw themselves onto the casket to hold it down and make sure that it makes it to the United States, which it does. And they make their way to the Washington Navy Yard, and it's here that this famous photo is taken of the men that are carrying the casket back. And they then bring it to the United States Capitol, where it lays in state. And then there's a massive procession that goes from the U.S. Capitol down several streets in D.C. to near the bridge that crosses over to Arlington. And it's here that the president himself, makes a speech. They actually use radio for the first time, or a form of it, to broadcast to, the United States what's said, President Harding. And it's really this is an amazing ceremony, because it represents who we are as Americans. It represents all who have fought, but it's also an opportunity to sort of heal some wounds. And there's members and veterans from both sides of the Civil War there. There's African Americans there. It's really kind of a cross section of the United States that comes, and they give the final honors. It's really quite extraordinary. One of the body bearers is a Cheyenne Indian, full-blooded, but they also give the final honors to Chief Plentycoos, who we have here, and he with Sergeant Saunders, who is the body bearer. It's Chief Plentycoos that lays his feathered war bonnet on the casket as they place soil that's from France into the crypt where the casket is placed. And there are, inside of the tomb of the unknown soldier, there are 3 bodies of unknown soldiers. There's the World War I unknown soldier, there's a World War II unknown soldier, and there's a Korean War unknown soldier. Initially, the crypt contained a soldier from the Vietnam War, but the family of that airman believed that it was their son, and they eventually prevailed in the case, and DNA testing revealed them to be right, and he was removed from the tomb and then reburied with full military honors. But that's the story of the unknowns. It's a story of who we are as Americans. It's a story of World War I, which changed America. It's a combat history of World War I. And it's the book that found me. So I'm very honored to be your guest today, and I'm happy to take questions from anybody that has any.
Anyone with questions can type them in the chat, or again, raise your hand in Zoom by going to the reaction button and clicking the raise hand button.
I'd also mention that you guys got me at the very beginning. Next week is when I begin my new book tour for The Indispensables, which is it's a story of arguably one of the greatest fighting regiments of the American Revolution, which was a diverse regiments that included African Americans and Indians. They rode Washington across the Delaware. They formed the Life Guard. They formed the Navy. It's really a truly extraordinary untold story.
So can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
So I have a question. So, most of us have heard of Alvin York, and I guess a lot of us may think of him as the most famous enlisted man. Why wasn't he selected?
Because they chose Samuel Woodfield, who was kind of his arch rival in a sense, and who was equally, during the war and shortly after, just as famous. And they had a goal. Pershing wanted to represent the infantry, the Marine Corps, the Navy, believe it or not, the cavalry, which is also in the book, field artillery, heavy artillery, and then another sort of combat specialization. So the infantry was already filled, and Pershing personally selected Woodfield. He thought he was the greatest hero of World War I, even a little bit over Alvin York, who now is, famous from all of his, the movies that have been made about him, etc. And he was also truly a great hero. There's no doubt about it. There's actually books out now where this York story is a little bit more complex than we know. It's, he wasn't just alone. He was with other members of his platoon that did something too. So That's sort of the reason. It was Pershing's choice, and it was Pershing's end choice for all these individuals.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Mike, if you want to unmute yourself so you can ask a question.
Sure. Patrick, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
My name is Mike. I'm from a local guy here in Frankfurt, and this is more of a personal question that I came up with. Do you enjoy the research more than the writing, or vice versa?
That's a great question. I would probably say I enjoy the journey more. And what I guess what I mean by that is the writing is part of the journey, but my favorite part of the journey probably is the research. And I do all my own research myself. You can see kind of behind me, I get into the weeds. Those are actually, like, the helmet behind my head is actually a World War I helmet from the 6th Machine Gun Battalion of the Marine Corps. It's exceptionally rare. There's other items and artifacts on here too. But I get into not only finding the original source documents, I walk the ground everywhere that I write about. If it's in Trenton, New Jersey, or Bella Wood, I've walked it pretty extensively. Anything that I write about, because you kind of, like, it's like being a detective. You have to go to the scene of the crime to really understand what went down. So I would say that my favorite part of it is the research, and that especially applies to when I was doing I've written 7 books on World War II. I've interviewed hundreds of thousands of veterans from World War II, and that was some of the most precious experiences of my life, actually.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for the question.
Mindy says, thank you, Patrick, for sharing your wealth of knowledge and passion for our soldiers. I look forward to reading your new book.
Thank you, Mindy, for just sort of, we had this initially scheduled for last year, and we kind of stuck with it. And I appreciate, you guys for doing that. It's been really an honor to come on. Do we have anybody else, or are we done?
I think that is everyone. Thank you, everyone, for coming to our Zoom program. And thank you, Patrick, for visiting us and showing us all the great pictures and sharing the stories with us. And thank you again to all of our sponsors. I hope everyone comes to see our exhibit in the McGowan Gallery. And if you want to know what else we have coming up, please visit myfcpl.org/calendar. All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
You too. Thank you.